feel free to share your screen and we can get started.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ben, for the introduction and for arranging this. This is awesome. And the Raspberry Pi, oh, my first desktop, it reminds me of my first desktop, the configuration that it had. It was like in my wildest dreams, I never thought that 8 GB of RAM and 128 GB of disk. It used to come with like 5 GB, 10 GB. That's the max. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me start with the presentation first. And the way I'm going to take this is not taking it in a very formal way. So it's more of an interaction. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and we would explore the options that's there in Vro. So don't hesitate to ask questions. Okay. Um, the topic is polyglottism in Vro, or in an easier way, getting started with the multiple scripting languages, how we can take advantage of this new functionality that's there in Vro. I'm a staff architect with professional services in in VMware. A little bit about myself, with VMware for 9+ years. Automation is my hobby. Apart from my day job, which is something different, I work as an architect, but then automation has been always my hobby. So PowerShell, I have written that book for that, a couple of patents on hybrid cloud storage, a lot of different things, a lot of different certifications. I started my career in Linux, so that's my first love. So, and then I got into VMware, and then that really changed my life, I'd say. So what is polyglottism? It is actually the use of many languages. Anyone who can speak multiple languages, which is bilingual, multilingual, or more, they are a polyglot. So that's what it is. That's what the definition is. But in terms of software development, what is polyglottism, and why do we even talk about that? Because typically, or traditionally, when we developed an application, we developed that application on a certain language. So for example, I'm developing a kernel, operating system kernel or kernel driver, device drivers, we would go ahead with C. But as and when the development, software development progressed, now we have multiple teams, multiple experts, domain experts in those languages working together to build new applications. Also, if you look into the trend that we are in today, the applications are really, the churn rate of the applications are really high. It's like they are getting developed really quickly. Sometimes the organizations, they release new versions multiple times in a day, in a single day. So how do you cope up with that? And the major question is, now the development scenario is so diverse. It's not the same like 15 years or 20 years back when the options were pretty limited. But now we have so many options, like we have databases, so many databases. We have SQL databases, NoSQL databases. One type of database can do something better. So should we limit ourselves with the only the limited options that we have? We do not. And especially with microservices, things have become more easier. I know with microservices, we have services running in discrete environment, and then they're talking to each other. So that gives us the flexibility to build an application which has different parts, and we can utilize different technologies for those different parts. We do not need to have a homogeneous environment there. We can have heterogeneous environment. So some language does something better, and some other language does some part better. So we can take all of that and build an application which is made of, say, different parts. Some part is made in Node, some part is Python, Go, Java, all of that. And then the end application is something which is rock solid, performs the best. And that's where the polyglottism comes in software development. Now, there's another aspect as well. Earlier dates, we had something very defined like JavaScript would go into front end, that's typically client side. And then the back end would have Java or Python or PHP, the server side. Today, we do not have those boundaries, that much defined boundaries. The JavaScript can be utilized in the front end client side and the back end development as well, the server side components. So those boundaries are getting blurred. So we can utilize any language anywhere, and that's where all of that comes. Right now, what's the advantage of and disadvantages? The first advantage is you get best of all worlds, the power to mix and match, and the faster iterations. But the disadvantage is, like, for an architect, software architect, if he needs to decide which language to choose for what, that is going to be crazy choice. It's like you'd be always in two minds. Should I use this language for doing this? Or should I use that language for doing that? So that choice is really hard. The second thing is, when you become a polyglot, you become more like a mercenary. I mean, at least for me, I know multiple languages. I'm comfortable with PowerShell. I'm comfortable with JavaScript, Python. But then, can I call myself really an expert on any one of them? I don't know. So that is one of the disadvantages, possible disadvantages, not always, of that. Now, the disadvantages of that, I can give you my example. So I had my blog site, hosted in WordPress, hosted by some company. And then one day I decided, when the renewal came, that they were charging me too much for that. And then the performance was not good. So the response time was always not acceptable to me. So I decided, okay, I'm going to build my own website, custom theme, and everything by my own. So I moved to static sites, and I did my research and then went for Hexo and that platform. And I built that theme based on VMware Clarity from scratch, amazing performance, everything is working fine. After some time, I could see that there was some problem. I lost my laptop and stuff, and I had to rebuild. And I thought, okay, let's do it through Hugo. So I learned Go language, and again did everything in that way, because that was the new thing, new kid on the block. But then, doing all of that, I actually started writing less and less blogs. So that was the purpose. So I lost my way, and I spent more time into learning all of that and doing that. So that is one pitfall that I faced personally. But then it also helped me coming up with many things. Coming to Vro Orchestrator, um, can you just raise a quick hand and tell me how many of you have worked with this in past and then are familiar with Vro Orchestrator in their previous avatars? I would say just a quick hand raise here in Zoom. Great. Okay, so we know that traditionally Vro supported JavaScript. So that's the core. It was built on JavaScript, right? So whenever we had to write some script, we will have to go ahead in the JavaScript way. But with 8.x, the latest version, Vro introduced the support for Node.js, Python, and PowerShell. So now we can say it's a platform where we can practice polyglottism. We can write scripts in polyglot way. So these are the support that we have, but then still JavaScript is the default language or the underlying. So you would see the more or the most support or supported way is JavaScript way. The APIs, if you want to call the APIs, the plugins, all are in JavaScript. But since I have these options, Node.js and then Python and PowerShell, I can reuse my other scripts in Vro Orchestrator, and then we would see how we can do that. So the core concepts, the supported versions, and 8.4, the latest version, Python 3.7, Node.js 12, and PowerShell, the two different versions are supported, the 6.2 or PowerShell 7. So these are the versions that are supported in Vro. Now, in Vro, we know that we can create workflows and then we can create actions. right? So when should we use a workflow? When we should write actions? Now, workflow, so we have a larger workflow with a lot of moving components, and in that, something we want to write a small script. So that way we should use workflow, but then actions are independent entities. So I'm defining something which is independent of the workflow that we're writing. So that means I can reuse that component. Also, I can maintain the life cycle of that script outside of my workflows. So that's really an easy way of looking into the way I want to write some custom scripts. So if you want to do something quick and get some quick results, probably within a workflow, you can write a script. But then if you are building a larger workflow where you have a reusable components, you want to reuse that multiple times, that's actions is the way. There is another limitations, and we'll be talking about that in while I show you the demo. Is actions lets you add the custom modules, because Vro, the environments are there inside that Vro appliance. Now, what if there is a module that you're looking which is not in that environment? So how do you get that module that you want to work on? So the actions is the only way that's supported when you want to use your custom modules. So that's where you would use actions. So pretty much clear on actions and workflows where you should use which one. Uh, every script, custom script that you need to write in these languages needs to have an entry point in the script, which is a function, which is typically by default, it's handler, it's called handler, and it has two inputs. One is context and then inputs. Context gives you the context of the application, the script or the environment, and then inputs are the inputs that you take, and then you can return back outputs. So that's the default function. You need, your script needs to have that function. If you do not have that function defined, your script will not run. It would give you an error. So whether you utilize that function or not, you need to have that default function defined there. And then entry handler, it doesn't mean that the function needs to be handler. It can be something else as well, but then by default, it expects it to be handler.handler. That means if you are writing your own scripts, that folder or that file, that's entry file needs to be handler. Say if I'm writing something in Python, right? So that file needs to be handler.py or PowerShell handler.ps1. And within that file, I need to have a function which is called handler. So that's why entry handler is handler.handler. Within that handler file, I have handler function. If you change that, say, for example, you make the name as say index.js, or you want to write a script in Node.js. So your file name becomes index.js, and within that, you have a function which say call me. So your entry handler, you need to update that as index.callme, because that's the way if you would understand that, okay, I have these files, so multiple files, and within that index is my entry point. Within that index, call me is my entry function. So be aware of that context, that you need to, if you want to change that, then you need to change that entry handler as well. Otherwise, just keep the default, it would take care of it. The other point is runtime limits. Now, by default, the runtime, because it's running within Vro, and in large, it's a VRA appliance, right? Vro is within the VRA appliance. If you're talking about embedded Vro in VRA context. So every runtime has their memory limits set. By default, it's 64 MB, and the timeout is 180 seconds. So seconds, I need to check that, seconds or millisecond. But then memory oftentimes, like for example, PowerShell, if you're running some PowerShell or PowerCLI scripts, it would require you to increase your memory. So you need to increase the memory to something like say 128 MB or 256 MB, and that would handle. Otherwise, your action or workload would fail, giving you the error. And here is also the other point. Within a workflow, you cannot set the runtime memory. But then if it's an action, which is where they should really go if you have custom scripts and everything, then you can set the runtime limits. So that is another reason why you can write or you should depend on actions. But saying that, it typically depends on the script that you have, how large that is, what's the memory requirement. Depending on that, you may or may not need to update the runtime limits. The other important point, PowerCLI. Uh, PowerShell goes a long way with VMware environment. So that's probably one of the best ways to automate VMware environments. This implementation comes pre-built with the PowerCLI, VMware.PowerCLI, PowerNSX, and PowerVRA modules. That means you can do a lot of stuff out of the box if you're using PowerCLI. So if you really want to automate VMware environment or you want to interact with VMware environments, so you probably VRA, vCenter server, or NSX within and around like custom scripts for that, which is not available out of the box for you. Probably PowerCLI way would be my first preference. And if I'm just doing say REST API calls and other interaction with third-party tools, go ahead with Python or Node.js, whichever you are comfortable with. But if you are inherently talking to VMware environment, I would probably, it's my personal preference, given the modules that's there, I would go ahead with PowerShell way, PowerCLI. Any questions before I jump into demos? And I would come back to this slide later on because I have a last slide, which I found really interesting, really funny. But any questions or anything? You can unmute yourself and then ask the questions if you want. Okay. So let me jump into, say, the demo. So let's go into Vro Orchestrator, and to showcase how it works, I have very simple examples which are actually available as a hands-on lab. So I have a couple of things defined in workflows, and then I would showcase one action. What's the difference and all that, right? So this I have this VRA environment. Sorry, vSphere environment. So I'm directly working with the vSphere environment for this demo. Not going into VRA and that. So here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a tag in vCenter server, get that tag, and then delete that tag. But for these three tasks, I would use three different languages, right? So let's get to tags and custom attributes. Right now, there are no tags defined in this environment. Okay, and is my screen visible, Ben?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, so let's first create the tag, and for this we have used Node.js, and this is a plain workflow. So all I had to do is, and there's no input and output, but then just a schema. So we got a scriptable task here, and the scripting is based on Node.js. When you create a new scriptable task, you can define the runtime. What's the runtime that you are going to use for that scriptable task? And we have all these options: Node.js, JavaScript, PowerShell 11, and then 12 or Python. This is Node.js, and this is the entry handler. That's the function. So here we're not doing anything much in that function. We're not even using the inputs. We're just doing REST API calls, the API calls to the vCenter server, and then creating the tags for that environment. That's what we're doing. And note that this is independent of that function. We're really not using any inputs. I'm not giving any callback or nothing. I'm not taking any inputs or outputs at all. I'm just doing something else, but then still that function needs to be there. If I remove that function, I'm going to get an error message. So let's run that workflow and see the output. So that has been created. I got the task tag creation status code as 200. So let's see whether the tag was created or not. I see that's a my custom tag. The category is demo, and then this is a tag description. The description has been created for me when I had run that script. So in terms of what it's doing, I'm just defining the tag name, the tag descriptions, and then this is it's not really secure because I have everything hard coded there. I could have taken these variables, username, password, as inputs from the user at the runtime, but then this is hard coded just to showcase how the scripts work. So I'm just getting a session from the vCenter server using the host name, the path that I need to post to get the session, and then getting just method, following the method, and then it's setting up the headers, calling out that session so that we have the session. And then when we have the session, we are creating the specs for creating the tags. And then I gave it the category. Now you may ask me how I get this category, and there's a very easy hack to that. You go to vSphere or vCenter server or VRA for that matter. When you go there, I have seen that this is the category, right? I had created a category by the name demo. If you select that in the URL, you would see that this already comes. So I just simply copy pasted that from here. That's how you get the UID. This is the easiest way. The hard way, if you really want to automate that, you will have to query vCenter server to get the categories, and then get a particular category that you are looking for, get the UID for that. And so you will have to go through all the hoops. Since I just wanted to showcase the functionality of the script, I just hard coded it with this category ID, and that's how you would get that. So same thing goes for VRA. If you have a blueprint and you really want to say you are defining an AVX action or something of that sort, you can get that blueprint UID from the URL. You can always get that from here. So that's a hack that I always utilize for my scripts. So I defined that tag options, and then tag request, and then requesting for that. And then if there is an error, it will throw out the error. Otherwise, it's just going to write the tag data. So that's what the script is doing. And this is entirely written on Node.js. Now, I have that. Now, let's get that tag. And now this time, let's do it using PowerShell. So this time I have a scripting, and I'm utilizing PowerShell 7.0. And this is the function, defining function, the entry point. The same function handler, it takes two variables, contexts and inputs, and by means of inputs, its properties. That means it's a JSON format, or it's a VRO property, so you can convert it into JSON and then access the variables, and then you can return any output from the function. So if you are writing something and if you want to return back something, use this function. So you want to take inputs, process that, send some value back, use this variable to return something back, and inputs is the processing. So again, the username, password, I'm creating a session to vCenter servers, and then it's just purely REST method. So invoking REST method with the vCenter server, getting a session, and then getting the categories and then tags. So let's run that and see the output. So we see that it gave me the session ID, the first tag ID, the tag name, my custom tag, and then the description. These are tag descriptions. So, and then tag category ID, the tag ID, all of that information. So it gave me all of that information. And this is purely written on PowerShell. So just interacting with the vCenter server, getting that information back from PowerShell. Now, the third task that we want to do Just give me a second. Let me close this window. Okay, hope this is better. And the third task is we would delete that vSphere tag using Python as the programming language. So again, this is the definition. This is the function. So this is the handler, entry point, context, and inputs are the two variables. So typically, if you have any inputs, you can utilize that. And importing certain functional libraries, and then talking to the vCenter server, getting the session, and then building the tag. So that's exactly what it's doing. So let's run that script, and then the tag was deleted. Let's get back here and then see whether the tags were really deleted or not. And we see that it has been deleted. So similar task, three different ways. When we were creating the tag using Node.js, we could delete that using Node.js as well. But then just maintaining the lifecycle just to show that how we can utilize three different ways. And these are workflows. So there may be multiple complex other workflows, nested workflows, any other n number of things. And part of that is a scriptable task. And we just defined that scripts using different languages. And all three of them are doing tagging, managing the lifecycle of tagging. So that's the easiest example, right? Any question? Any questions so far before I jump into the next part? Okay. So, you know, this is one of the scripts that I had written. This shows you an example of how you can take the inputs and then show something. And this example is actually PowerShell and utilizing that inherent Power CLI connect to VI server and all of that. So if I'm using PowerShell, if I want to interact with vCenter server or say NSX manager for that matter, why do I need to go through REST APIs? Because REST APIs means I'll have to handle the raw calls. I need to know what exactly the body needs to be. I need to handle the return data and then parse out the JSON data to find out exactly what I'm looking for. Instead, I have all these modules available to me. The other script that I was doing when I was interacting with vCenter server using PowerShell, CLI, you see that I had to go through so many ways to handle the REST method and all of that just to do what we were trying to do. But here, it's much easier. See the number of lines that I'm writing here. I'm just taking the inputs, saying that invalid certifications in production environment, you won't have to worry about that because production environment should be with proper certificates. So you shouldn't have to worry about that. I'm just doing connect VI server and then taking as input the vCenter server, the user ID, password, and then getting the list of the virtual machines. So probably that's the simplest example. I'm just getting a list of the virtual machines, but then I can do any other things which the modules of the Power CLI modules gives me. So let's run this and see how it works. VCACI local. So it's utilizing, it's running, and it gave me, I am just printing it out. That was the inputs, probably will not print it out, but then this exactly gave me the list of virtual machines running in that environment. So what I was trying to do, interacting with vCenter server using Power CLI, and that made my life really easy, quick and easy way. So again, if you are really interacting with the VMware environment, say VRA or NSX or vCenter server, go ahead and use PowerShell, and you can PowerShell. You can reuse all of your scripts, and then that's how you take the inputs. I had that input variable. So whatever you pass through the input variables, multiple input variables, I had 3 different variables, one for vCenter server, one for user ID, and one for password. All of them are there, and then I changed it to JSON format so that I can call them out individually, like inputs.vCenter input.user ID. It's very easy to manipulate in that way, and then I'm doing what I want. The other thing is, while I was defining that script, you see this runtime limits. Uh, this is how where I can change that, and then this is in 180 is in seconds. Now, if I change it back to 64 and then see whether it still runs. So 64 is by default. And we get that error message. So this is the error message that you would get on all probability. If you see this error message, that function was stopped, most likely because of it ran out of the memory condition. That's because of memory limit. So if you face this error message, just go ahead and then update that to something which is more required. And specifically, this is true for PowerShell, because the PowerShell modules are heavy, so they would need higher memory. So just be aware of that that fact, right? So this, I changed the memory limit, and then that ran fine. And also, if you have an environment which is pretty large, and you know that the query that you are making, return time is going to be more than 180 seconds, then please go ahead and update that. Otherwise, your script would fail. So these two options are available in action only. So as I was saying earlier, I created actions. That's where I have the runtime limits. When I was writing the workflows, part of the workflow is script, but then I don't have those options. I have only input, outputs, and then exception handling. Scripting is all about scripting, right? So if you are writing, and specifically you're writing some script which is pretty large, go through the action route so that you can have better control over that. Now, let me showcase another example, this time in Python. So this time I wanted to write a Python script, and I wanted to do something for which I didn't have the modules there. So the modules that I'm looking for is requests, because I want to make direct calls to some APIs, and then I'm going to utilize predictable. The output format I want in a predictable, and then a requests package was not there. So the way you would do that, so it's not that you will have to always write scripts here. If you want to write a script which has a larger multiple parts, multiple files, and then there you need some modules which is not there by default. So how do you take care of that? So instead of writing script, when you say I'm defining an action, and you go to scripts, you say define the runtime, and then you can define the type, whether you want to write the script here or get a zip package. So you will have to create your own zip package. The process for doing that is create a folder, say just any, give it a name in a folder, create a folder inside that as lib. So that's the way, it's lib. And then if it's PowerShell, then that's the folder that you need to create, which is module, with the name should be modules. Right? And then you install the required modules there. So what I did, I went to this lib folder, and then I installed all the modules that I needed. So the modules that I needed was pip, and typically in Python you would install it through pip. So since this 3.7 environment, so pip3 install requests. So I said that this is the place where I want to install. This is the target is lib folder. And then the second time I was inside lib folder, so I said pip3 install predictable. Right. So that installed predictable for me. So now if I go back to this lib folder, I should be able to see all of those the modules, the predictables modules, and then the other module, requests module, and everything. So this folder should have that lib file, and then my entry point handler.py. I could have used, if I'm writing multiple complex scripts, I may have the other files, but the entry point is handler.py file. And then if I'm changing that to index.py or something else, so I need to change that entry handler to index dot something else. And then within that handler.py file, I still have that handler function. So I still have that handler function, which is not doing anything. I'm really not utilizing it for anything else. I have other functions defined, but then it knows which function it needs to go to, what's the entry point in that inside that script. So if I look closely inside this script, what I'm doing, I'm interacting with the VRA, and then I want to get a list of the blueprints that's there in the VRA. So defining that FQDN, defining the API URL base, and then I defined a separate function to get the token. So I'm getting the token through calling the REST APIs, directly calling the APIs for that. So getting the API version, and then this is the token. This is the way to get the token. So I'm getting the CSP token, and then I'm getting the IAS token. So I first get the refresh token, and with that refresh token, I'm getting the original token, the bearer token. So two steps actually when I talk directly with the VRA. So first we get the refresh token, and then using the refresh token, I get the bearer token, and using that bearer token, I am actually calling out the blueprints, API blueprints, and getting a list of that. So if I run that here in normal environment in Python, ideally, I would say, so I can run that outside of that and get that input. So I developed the script, I ran it in my environment, in my machine, and then see that, okay, everything is running fine. I troubleshooted that, and then get everything there, create a zip file. Doesn't matter, the name of the zip file can be anything, but then extension is .zip. And then when I'm defining that, okay, I'm creating an action, runtime is Python 3.7, type it zip, I need to import that zip file. So now that zip file has all the libraries or the modules that I'm going to call, the dependencies and the script that I want to run. And this is the entry handler I need to mention. Save it. The moment you save, it gets uploaded, and then saved. You can run that and see whether it's working in Vro or not. And I can see it ran perfectly in VRA. So Vro environment, I got the blueprint ID, the blueprint name, the status, who created that, who updated that, the organization ID, project ID, and a lot of other information that I wanted to get from that environment. So that's how, if the function is already there, the dependencies are already there, I don't need to create a zip file. I can simply go ahead and write scripts in Vro itself directly and get what we wanted to get. But then if I have a dependency for which there's the modules are not there by default in Vro environment, that's how I would create my own dependency, get the libraries, write my own scripts. Or if I have multiple scripts, get into a zip package, update the zip, define the action. Now my action is ready for consumption. And then in a workflow, I can simply go ahead and call this action to do this task for me, right? And while defining this action as well, I changed the memory limits because I needed higher memory. So that's how typically you would write or utilize polyglottism in VRO. And the purpose is whichever way you are comfortable, depending on what exactly you want to do, you would utilize one of the programming languages that you want. So probably if I'm interacting with REST APIs and all of that, Node.js is probably the easiest way. Python, if I'm doing custom, um, calculations or something else, probably Python is the way. Interacting with the VMware environment as part of custom scripts. So Power CLI probably I would go ahead and utilize because it comes with pre-built modules, which makes your life really easier. An example is in front of you, just this much, 2 lines, and I could get the same information. If I have to really go ahead and utilize REST APIs, I will have to get the token first, and then using the tokens, I need to know exactly what URL I need to go to and all of that. Here, I'm just simply connect to VI server, and then since I'm connected, I'm just getting list. Probably easiest of the examples, but then it would give you an example. And then with any programming language, your imagination is the limit. Whatever you want, you can do it. So with that, when
You think they'll ever let you add modules that you want to use instead of doing the zip file?
which way? So it's the modules in the VRO itself.
Yeah, like I use the Microsoft SQL PowerShell module a lot with my automation, and it would be nice if you could import that into VRO so that you don't have to do that zip file. It's just like if they're looking at that for future releases at all, maybe to let you import modules that would actually live on the appliance.
So probably in future, I have no visibility into that. The one aspect of that is one dangerous aspect. Everything has its positive and negatives. If the VRA appliance or the VRA appliance for that matter is it's containerized, so you can very quickly they can purge the containers and then redeploy it. So that's the advantage of that. Now, if I let end users upload a lot of custom modules or custom code and everything, that becomes heavy. So it becomes very problematic for that environment to manage, and then troubleshooting that environment also becomes very problematic. So it goes both ways. So I'm not sure what they are thinking. There's no plan as of now that I'm aware of that they would allow to install custom modules, but then probably in future they would do that as and when more requests comes. If enough requests comes, then they may look into that. But till that point, modules is the way. So you'll have to zip that.
Yeah, because every time you make a code change, you have to re-import the zip file then.
Yeah, that's painful. I agree with you. That's really painful. But right now we are limited by that. As I mentioned that the flip side of that is maintenance and possibility of cumbersome troubleshooting or even some other problems. Right. So it would be good to have. It would be really, doing that would solve a lot of problems, especially with PowerShell. I know I wanted to write a script where for Linux environments, I wanted to, like, when from VRA, my environment is getting deployed, the VM should go ahead and talk to my AD server to update the DNS entries and delete it. I had to import modules. So there's no, by default, the modules that's there in the PowerShell environment doesn't include those modules. So I had to do that way. And then other ways, if you want to work with Azure environment, we'll have to import the modules. So it becomes cumbersome. So we hope in future probably we'll get something of that sort.
Yeah, in my environment, we're probably 90% Windows. So what we ended up doing is having an external PowerShell server that we have a workflow and orchestrator that we send the commands over to a PowerShell host and still run them that way. That way that host can have the PowerShell modules included.
That's the way I did it. I go to external PowerShell host, but setting up that PowerShell host may be sometimes challenging, but then that's the best way. If you have that external PowerShell host setup, you can do a lot of stuff, a lot of flexibility. The problem again with that, you have a touch points. So you have a workflow. So it's going to go out of VRO and go to PowerShell host and then run something and then come back. So that means the more touch points or stepping stones that you create in a script, there are more probabilities or possibilities for failure. Something probably not problematic with your script, but then that environment had some problem. Your entire workflow fails. So we just started with this polyglottism within VRO. Probably with next couple of iterations, a lot of that would be, I suspect a lot of that would be answered, but then we do not have any definitive answer to that right now. It's needed definitely, but probably in future. Right. So while doing my studies, I came up with this this website, curlshow.com start coding, which was very interesting because it's a bit dated, but it was really interesting to read the Lord of Rings analogy to programming languages like Python, the end, like ancient, and then what it does, easier to run and all of that. That was really, really fun to read. So if you have some time, probably you can read that. That is, I really found it really interesting. And then which way to find out which language to use and then which languages to learn. That thought process is so fun way to watch and get an idea about that. It's really interesting. Really interesting. It doesn't cover the latest languages like Go and in some everything else, but then it talks about Python, Java, C, C++, JavaScript, Ruby. I don't know how many people uses Ruby today. Objective C is that's only, yeah, it's a smog. I agree. PHP is the or oh, I mean, I so agreed with what it's mentioned here and the way it's mentioned here. I don't know about this part, so I shouldn't comment on that. But then popularity and then difficulty level to understand, difficulty level to learn that language, to master that is really, really, really fun. So I would share this link, and then if you have time, you may go there and then have fun there as well. Fun reading that. Right. So with that, I am done with my presentation. Any further questions, I'd be happy to answer.